On November 30th of this year, British Columbia says it will no longer allow the trophy hunting of grizzly bears in the Canadian province. Of the approximately 15,000 grizzlies in British Columbia, about 250 are killed by hunters annually, according to government figures. Forests, Lands, Natural Resource Operations, and Rural Development Minister Doug Donaldson characterized that level of hunting as sustainable in an interview with the CBC. However, he says the decision to end trophy hunting is not a matter of numbers. It's a matter of society has come to the point in British Columbia where they are no longer in favor of the grizzly bear trophy hunt. The key word in the above statement is trophy. As stated, the population of grizzly bears is robust and the harvest rates are sustainable. But regardless of these facts, grizzly bear hunting has been banned by the voice of the people. And something that was legal is not legal anymore. I've been saying this for a long time. Legal is not an argument for hunting. As Stephen Ranilla recently said on one of his podcasts, it's legal for a man to cheat on his wife, but nobody believes that makes it okay. On this episode of Gritty Bowmen, I talk with Shane Mahoney. Shane Patrick Mahoney is the president and CEO of Conservation Visions. A Newfoundland native, he holds both an honors and a master's of science degree in zoology from Memorial University of Newfoundland. Mahoney has over 30 years' experience working primarily as a scientist, wildlife manager, policy innovator, and strategic advisor. Shane is a brilliant and passionate conservationist, and he has been working on a massive project called the Wild Harvest Initiative. Shane explains it like this. Safe, healthy food is important to everyone. Every year, some 40 million citizens in the United States and Canada take to the fields, mountains, forests, streams, and lakes, returning with a harvest of wildlife and fish to feed their families and share with friends. Just how much of this natural organic food do these two nations provide annually, and how valuable is it to our societies? At this point, no one really knows. It's time we did know. We've known for well over a century that conservation of the world's ecosystems is critical to human well-being, and that the sustainable use of wild resources brings enormous and unique benefits to human beings everywhere. So why did 90% of the electorate vote against trophy hunting grizzly bears? If you're a hunter, are you surprised by this vote? What motives and values do we display and promote on our TV shows and social media outlets? And does it matter? If we send the wrong message, what's at stake? These are the sorts of questions that Shane tackles on a regular basis. I feel fortunate to have had the opportunity to personally visit with Shane and have him as a guest on this podcast. I hope you listen to this entire episode and that it causes you to feel an increased measure of concern for wild animals and wild places. For hunters have an inseparable relationship with nature and a responsibility to protect it. Talk to me.
Mary had a little lamb. Its fleece was black as tar. 10-9-8-7.
All right, folks. Welcome to the Gritty Bowmen podcast. I am here today in Bozeman, Montana, with Shane Mahoney. And for those of you who don't know and have been living under a rock, Shane Mahoney is a renowned conservationist, and you have your own podcast now, which I have, I think, consumed every episode of, which is called Conservation Matters Podcast. And I first came across you when you were on Randy Newberg's podcast.
Yep.
And, you know, I'm kind of late to this conservation game. And I think the truth is a lot of hunters are actually. From at least like my world and some of the younger guys that I've spent time with, we've always been members of like Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and we've kind of supported that stuff. But we kind of, at least for me, we kind of felt like if we just became a member, then we'd done what we needed to do.
Yeah.
And as I've been more engaged in the podcast and the Gritty Bowmen and in the hunting community, and learning, now I have this kind of blooming passion for conservation that I didn't have before. I always cared about animals, but now it's growing into something where I want to really make a concerted difference. And I feel like there's a lot of folks in my audience in the same boat that have really come on lately, and have really focused on making a difference.
Right.
And we are always pushing at Gritty Bowmen, like, get a camera out, get out and film your adventures, get out and tell people why you love to be outdoors, inspire them with your photography, inspire them with, because every little person that has a story to tell about how the outdoors influences or makes them better has influence on their local communities and the perception of hunting, and then the desire to, take care of the world around them. Mm-hmm. So that's a long way to say I'm a big fan of Shane Mahoney, and I have been listening to pretty much most of what you've produced in the last, ever since I heard you on that podcast with Randy.
Well, I'm pleased to be here. Thank you for having me.
Just so people have some context that may not be familiar with you, can you tell me a little bit about why you think America, the United States of America, is unique?
Well, there are a lot of reasons why the country is unique, and there are a lot of unique things about the country, which are not exactly the same things. First of all, we have in the United States of America a relatively young country by global history standards. That was essentially founded, if you will, by European individuals who often were escaping some kind of very difficult circumstance in the countries they left, either religious or economic, and not wishing to diminish the fact that there was an incredible assemblage of native peoples here at the time, speaking some 350 languages, etc. It was still the origins of the country as we understand it in the history going forward from that European time or that European arrival is truly remarkable because of the unlikeliness initially, and even as you reflect on it, of the United States of America emerging as sort of the dominant country in the world. You know, by almost any standards that people want to apply, the United States has levels of influence and, in some cases, levels of authority or even power that really no other country really has. The United States of America is the only really true superpower in the world today, despite the fact that we've seen the rise of many different regions in the world, like the European Union, or the rise of amazing separate cultures in places like Japan or China, Russia, other places. The United States of America, since the time of its independence, seems to have been on a trajectory of becoming the most influential nation in the world. And what has emerged is a country that has its own tensions and its own differences from within, but it is a country that has had certain episodic situations face it where it demonstrated some inherent capacity to do really and truly great things that are out of the step with ordinary experience in global history. So, for example, one might look at how was it in this relatively small place of a few colonies existing in a sort of an uncoordinated way, you know, end up finding the capacity and the wherewithal to essentially defeat the greatest army and navy that the world up until that point in time had ever seen, which was Britain's.
Right.
This was, the odds were certainly not in America's favor at the time. And yet it was proven true that this would be the outcome of the War of Independence. And so you had this fledgling little nation without all of the sophistication of Britain, even essentially without a navy of its own at all, and certainly without an army that could, on paper, have compared with what the British had. Prove victorious in this war. So there's an example of why America has beaten the odds in circumstances which seem very improbable. If we go on to the creation of the political manifestos that were written surrounding that period of time, the Declaration of Independence, etc., we see some of the absolute greatest political manuscripts that the world has ever produced. We also saw at the time of the early parts of the awakening of the nation and the time of independence and so on, we saw constellations of geniuses that were very rare in the pageant of human history that came together at a time, the Adamses and the Jeffersons and the Franklins and the Madisons and the Washingtons and so on and so forth, that came together, that emerged out of this small scattered group of, these small colonies that were over here in essentially a wilderness continent, and create these absolute masterpieces that embody the hopes and dreams of nations the world over.
Shane, do you think, is there what made them like that?
Well, I think there was a combination of things. First of all, America had geography matters tremendously in the minds of people, the land in which they lived, the idea of expanse, the idea of greatness to some extent, I think, was embodied in the sheer scale and size of this country. America had many great advantages, of course, including ones during the War of Independence, in that it is isolated, essentially. It has oceans on each side.
Right.
It is a very difficult country to invade. You have to come from a long way away to invade this country if you're going to do it. And Britain, of course, experienced that in the War of Independence. We had certainly a feeling on the part of the people who came here that this really was an opportunity to do something entirely new, to do something that, to have an experience that would be completely different from what they had had before. And so I think the result of that, and the idea that they had come from problematic circumstances and they wanted and were determined that this would be different. The whole burgeoning idea of the time, from the revolutions that took place in Europe, including the French Revolution, this whole idea that the individual mattered and that, just excessive power from authoritative elites was not going to be tolerated. I think all of this became embedded in the American psyche. And in addition to that, there was this idea that, one had to forge by one's own effort and one's own determination what one's future was going to be. And yet, because many of these people were immigrants, because they were determined to build a new life, there also appeared in the American psyche this great idea of independence, this great idea of being self-sufficient. And of course, that eventually transcended itself into a desirable trait. It would be articulated. This is what we want Americans to be. Mm-hmm. We want the homesteaders to be. We want the people who move westward to be. We want this self-reliance was both essential to that purpose, but after a while it became sort of codified in what it meant to be American. And that, of course, became part of the patriotic kind of atmosphere, if you will, in which most Americans live their lives. And that is manifested today, every day of my experience in the United States. And I come to this country, 15 times a year now, maybe more. Mm-hmm. I see this manifested all the time. And this is why, when I hear conversations and part of conversations in other parts of the world, and people say, America has had its day, the economy is facing trouble, it's going to be a new world going forward. I just remind them, as somebody who knows American history fairly well, that I think any such predictions are really mistaken. I see nothing going forward that is going to change the geographic advantages that America has in terms of a country. It still has massive access to resources. It has amazing institutions, and despite all of the political turmoil that becomes such fodder for TV shows, the institutions in America are very strong. They, of course, have to be watchful that they're not undermined, like in any nation, but they are very strong. The economy, even when America's economy was faltering, it was still as big as the next two largest economies in the world combined. Militarily, the country is untouchable. I mean, regardless of what people say about the rise of, particular regions of the world, or, the fact that a nation like Turkey might have 1 million men under arms, or that, Russia could be antagonistic, or the rise of China, or at one point the rise of Japan earlier. The truth of the matter remains that the United States of America is so far ahead militarily that there really is a massive gulf between the country and elsewhere. So I still see, to me, the trajectory of superpower is still going to be with America for a very long period of time. And it is not only about the fact that America has power, but it's also about the way in which America exercises power. Now, I am not somebody who is, here to simply be a propagandist or a cheerleader for the United States of America. The country has its own problems. But when we look at something internally, first of all, like the American Civil War, the American Civil War could have been something that played out as either a conflict that led to years and years and years of guerrilla warfare, as forces in the South decided that they perhaps could not beat in an all-out campaign the very much industrialized and better funded North, and therefore sought to continue this conflict in that way, which is, in fact, what happens in almost all civil wars. They don't go away. They persist for generations, in some cases for decades in most. Or it could have been a case where the North could have simply said, well, we won, the conflict, and therefore the rest is going to be like this, based entirely on our terms. While there was some of those reverberations that took place, by and large, the American Civil War, one of the bloodiest, certainly the bloodiest engagement, we might say, that America has ever been engaged in, was on its, and the only one that was engaged on its own soil, because, as I said, really outside of the War of Independence, America has never been invaded, and the Japanese effort at Pearl Harbor. America has never really been subjected to warfare on its soil in that sense, but the conflict of the Civil War was brutal. It tore families apart. It tore regions apart. Officers that got their training, had to make a decision. Would they fight for the North? Would they fight for the South? And so on and so forth. I mean, it was an incredibly powerful and remains an iconic issue in American history. And yet the country put this behind itself, and the exercise of power, from my perspective looking at it, was dealt with in an incredibly modern way a very long period of time ago.
Right.
If we look at then something like the First and Second World Wars, and particularly the Second, there's no doubt, and the rest of the world ought to recognize this, without American engagement in the First and Second World Wars, the world in which we live would be a vastly different, and from my personal perspective, a much worse place in which to live. And in the case of the Second World War, it was fully expected. After that war, it was expected by all of the Allied countries that once this war was over and people came to America for a conference to sit down and decide what was going to happen with the world afterwards, that America was simply going to extend its hegemony and say, okay, well, you're really just satellite countries of us now, because, we
conquered you.
We conquered. We essentially made the difference. We are what gave you the chance to continue in existence. And that's not what happened. Now, America was very strategic in what it did. That is also true. But nevertheless, it did not follow the expected route that even its allies expected it to follow. Basically, it said, not only will we help rebuild your countries, which, in my view, ultimately led to the EU of today, and without it, there probably wouldn't be one. Not only will we rebuild your countries with our money, but also we will essentially guarantee safe trading around the world's oceans, and we will be the enforcer to make sure that that's true. And people today forget the fact that because America did that, other nations were able to flourish and rise again and repair themselves. And at the same time, America was able to do very well because, of course, it became a great producer of commodities, and, you know, it had a great deal of influence over international trade and monetary policies. And so, regardless, though, of how one cuts it, it was still an unexpected, unusual, unique thing for a nation in that particular position to actually do. So,
Yeah.
you know, I look at these things and I simply believe that, you know, these things were all improbable. The rise of the independent America, the escape from the creation of these incredible political manifestos and the manifestation of the ideals of individualism, of capitalism, of the idea of rule of law, of democracy, all of these kinds of things. I mean, America really did become the world's powerful spokesman for these kinds of ideas out of this group of backwoods people who were just trying to carve a living out of the wilderness. It's a phenomenal story this country has. And then, of course, it gave us conservation.
Well, and on that note, it's not the most pretty history either, because there's a lot of animals that were brought to the brink of extinction. What do you think, and who do you think was instrumental, maybe more than one person, of course, but how did that happen? How did we go from, I read a book recently, a couple of books on Daniel Boone, fascinated by him, and he comes through the Cumberland Gap, and he's there in Kentucky, and reading about the Indians and his relationship with them, being an adopted son of the Shawnee, and then being such a lover of the wild and the outdoors and nature, and at the same time this contradiction where he's leading humans and people into this area that he knows once they populate will become like it was further east. And yet there's this, I read the book, it was very fascinating to me to see the dichotomy between his desire for the natural world and his love for it, and then also this idea of colonizing and moving further west. And there's no doubt that I think that someone like Daniel Boone loved the wilderness and loved animals and loved even the Indian, and yet took a path that kind of ultimately brought them to destruction. What do you think about that? What do you think about how we came to destroy it and how we brought it back?
Well, the lives of nations, just like the lives of individuals, are full of contradictions. And so, you know, the idea of somebody like Boone or others who helped pave the way for settlers to move behind them, to move into lands that, number one, were occupied by indigenous cultures, and at the same time they were lands of wilderness where wildlife thrived in unbelievable abundance, but would eventually be, in the Jeffersonian ideal, conquered and brought under agriculture and the individual farm. And certainly many of these great woodsmen and frontier leaders were well aware that once people came, things would change. And they lamented that to real extent. But at the same time, many of them felt that this was inevitable, and that they therefore would play their part. They had certain personal incentives, financial and otherwise, that also motivated them, as it does people everywhere. And they probably retained some naive hope that, well, you know, maybe it just won't be that bad, and maybe we will be able to find the best way to accommodate. Remember, in the early days, the relationship between those mountain men, as we knew them, and the native peoples, for example, were often quite good. Many of them were adopted by various indigenous cultures, and many of them married into those cultures, and many of them, as more and more settlers came west, many of them regretted the loss in the lifestyles and the stature and the self-sufficiency of those peoples that they had first met. And they never intended for that to play out the way it did. You know, in the early days of frontier exploration and the movements associated with the gold rushes and so on, you know, in the early days when settlers moved into new regions, the mixed bloods, as they were called, you know, people who were the offspring of Native American women often and European men who had gone there, their offspring were actually, you know, highly respected and highly valued people because they often formed the go-between between people who were coming. They knew the languages, they knew the cultures, they knew the land and all of that. And after a period of about 50 years or so, or more time, gradually, of course, those people became the most marginalized in some cases of all. They weren't native, and they weren't European, and you can see in the history how they decline in sort of their social status and so forth. No one could have predicted those kinds of dynamics at the time. They were living through their lives. What happened in terms of the offtake of wildlife, however, was again rather unique and again contradictory and again very hard to predict. You know, the movement west, the belief that wildlife was inexhaustible, the idea that the real American subdued the wilderness, brought it under control, you know, took out the wild beast, made money in the meantime, did well for himself and his family, built his communities and so on. All of this eventually led to a massive depletion of wildlife, and we know that. But in a very strange way, it was one of the worst extirpations that this continent and the world has seen, which was in fact the almost total extirpation of the bison, down to a few animals from the 30 to 60 million that were here, eventually caused people to say, you know, I mean, enough is enough. And somehow the disappearance of the bison, and by then a sufficiently organized kind of media world, newspapers and so on, reporting this back, eventually caused a certain awakening in the American mind and in the political mind of America that, you know, there really had to be something better than this. And it was becoming clear by that time, in the late 1880s, post the Civil War and at the very end of the conflict between Native Americans and European settlers moving forward, that if something different wasn't done, then the implications for the country were really going to be severe, because forests were being denuded, you know, soil was being lost, the great runs of fishes in rivers were being depleted, not because people were fishing them out so much as that the rivers were just being destroyed from siltation and log jams and industrial activity on those rivers, and so on and so forth. And as always happens, a handful of very motivated, insightful, intelligent people said, hey, enough is enough. So, you know, at that very period, post-Civil War, at the very end of the Native American-European conflict, we see in 1887 the creation of the Boone and Crockett Club by Theodore Roosevelt and, you know, the handful of other influential people, George Bird Grinnell and others, who said, you know, there absolutely has to be, this is not American. This is Americanism gone wrong. And if we are really about this country, if we're really about protecting this country, we have to realize that the natural resources of this country make this country what it is. Without them, we are really nothing. We're just an isolated group of people over here on a big rock in between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And that slowly led to a transformation, of course, that eventually led to this whole idea of conservation and the whole idea that we needed a mixture of urgent action to protect certain species, like, for example, shorebirds and wading birds, which were being eliminated. You got to remember the first area that The first area that Theodore Roosevelt protected was Pelican Island. It wasn't done for big game hunting purposes or any other hunting purposes whatsoever. It was to protect the bird species from the feather trade, from the millinery trade. Mm-hmm. And he went on throughout his entire career to spend as much time protecting non-hunted species as he did protecting hunted species, which is a lesson I wish the hunting world of today would remember. And if they want to really, immortalize and imitate a leader justifiably, like Theodore Roosevelt, well, imitate all of him and not just part of him.
Right.
And don't leave aside these parts with these other species that you don't think are so important when he gave his life to essentially making sure that they remain with us, whether it was migratory songbirds or whether it was egrets or herons or pelicans or all these diverse array of species that he worked to protect. So he brought in this system, he and others, this system of this great mixture of protectionism, mm-hmm. but also, which was the remarkable thing, truly, that while the decimation of wildlife was obviously happening because we were killing it, we were hunting it to death, we were marketing it to death, we were mm-hmm. selling it to death, and so on. And some species like the Carolina parakeet and the passenger pigeon and the sea mink and many others just disappeared forever to the oblivion of extinction. The real genius behind the conservation idea was that a major thrust of it would be the use of wildlife. I mean, anybody logically thinking about this problem would say if all of the animals are being extirpated because we're hunting them and overhunting them, why don't we just stop all hunting?
Alone.
Just leave them alone. Just stop hunting. That would have been the totally logical thing. This is another uniqueness and genius of America. Instead of that, the sustainable utilization, or wise use, as Roosevelt called it, which is a fantastic term still, even though it got abused by industry to some extent, but in my view, it's still a fantastic term. Through wise use, you would build an incentivized community of citizens who would want to work to protect those wildlife species, and at the same time they would see they would be drawing benefits from natural systems that continue to produce those wildlife species. And this was the real genius behind what we call the North American model, which was really born here in the United States of America. It was counterintuitive and incredibly powerful what he did.
But do you think it was counterintuitive to him?
No, I don't think it was counterintuitive to him at all.
I think for me, as soon as I take someone hunting for the first time and they're out there with a bow and arrow and they're trying to kill an elk and you're bugling and the ones come charging in, that person now has a care for elk that they never had before.
Sure.
And when you talk about the genius of Theodore Roosevelt in that sense, I think how else can you get someone to care about wildlife than to have them partake of it like that?
Well, I think you have to be a bit careful in the sense that there are many people who don't hunt who are very passionate about wildlife. And some of them spend a great deal of time with wildlife, hiking, angling, watching, bird watching, photographing, and so on. Mm-hmm. And many of those individuals have incredible experiences in nature too. I spent decades of my career as a research biologist where I spent time in wilderness areas, always at wilderness areas, exclusively, very far away from people, and for very long periods of time, where I was not hunting at all. I didn't have a gun with me. I never carried a gun for protection from bears. I never carried mm-hmm. anything. And I had a lot of incredibly intense experiences with animals, some of which match, and some of which maybe even overwhelm some of the hunting experiences I have had. However, it is also absolutely true that when you have the experience in nature, when you are hunting, there is a difference to it. The level of intensity, the arousal of the senses, the awareness of the natural environment, the attention that you pay to details that might not be as important if you're on another kind of mission to engage with wildlife. Wind direction changes, signs that you are reading in terms of how close you are to a species, or the fact that you are searching for a particular species is not just being out there with them all. You're reaching for a specific species that has a specific ecology, a specific behavior. Then obviously you are focused in a way, the alert man, as Ortega y Gasset called it. You become the alert man. In the killing of the animal, of course, there's another transformation entirely. Number one is the fact that you engage in this very emotional and, I hope, difficult activity for most of us, in the sense that to take that elk or that moose or that black bear or that Canada goose or that wood duck from that living, shining, moving, emotive, reactive, inspiring creature, and to kill it means you have taken something, and you have taken a lot more than its own life. You have taken all the possibility of all of those kinds of engagements, even with yourself, away between that animal and you. It is gone in the moment of death. And at the same time, the responsibility for that, and then as one butchers the animal, one sees a part of the animal that the non-hunter never sees. You see the heart, you see the musculature, you see the blood, you see the connectivity, you see what made that animal be able to do what the animal does. This is a worldview that the non-hunter very seldom ever sees. And then on top of that, you learn the shape of the animal, where the meat lies, where the meat is scarce, where there is more bone, which is more tender, which are the big muscles that work to drive it, to run, to stand erect, to fight, the muscles around its neck for the rutting bulls, all these kinds of things. These are insights that only the hunter gains. And then, of course, you take care of the dead animal. No one in nature, other than the hunter, takes care of the dead animal. Only the hunter does this. And then that animal is carried. That animal is carried with you. The dead animal is carried with you. And you take it out, and then you prepare that. And then, of course, the ultimate transsubstantive experience, which is you consume the flesh of the animal that you have killed, and that, of course, becomes part of what is actually fueling you. And so, in that sense, you and the animal have now absolutely become one. It is a physical law that cannot be denied. So all of those kinds of things mean that there can be really intense experiences in nature. I have had animals do things in my company when I was not hunting that frankly would never have happened had I been hunting, because I was more purposeful. I was on a track. I was doing what I needed to be doing. In observing animals in the wild, sometimes you can be so indifferent to your surroundings in a sense, and so focused on something that other animals can treat you indifferently, and you can have very unique experiences with them. But having said that, there is a unique bundle of differences that come from hunting that, of course, turn a percentage of hunters. I don't know what that percentage is, but I can tell you it's not 100%. I can tell you it's probably 90%. It's probably not 90%, but I don't know what the percentage is. But it turns a percentage of hunters into extraordinary advocates for wildlife. And part of that is because they want to relive the experience. Part of that, I think, is a kind of subtle or latent sense of even guilt, that we have taken this life, we have removed it from that incredible experience that nature is. That, yes, it might have died, of course. Eventually it would have died. You know, you hear these arguments all the time. Well, it would have died anyway. Well, of course it would have died anyway, but that doesn't change the fact that it died by our hand. And the killing of an animal by one's hand is a very difficult thing. I have friends of mine who raise animals to eat. Rabbits, turkeys in some cases, hens, geese, and they find it extremely difficult to kill those animals. And these are hunters. These people are hunters. They find it extremely difficult to kill those animals that they've raised themselves. And so in some circumstances, when I would come, they would actually ask me to do this. And we would butcher the animal together and prepare it and so on and so forth. And so, it is not easy to take an animal's life, and it should not be easy to take an animal's life. And when things go wrong, as they sometimes do, when an animal is wounded, a very significant percentage of people who hunt are affected strongly by that. They don't want to see this. They don't want to see the animal wounded and struggling and things of this nature. And it affects people, as we all know, very, very emotionally. It can make it very difficult to then finish the animal, particularly if the circumstances are challenging for one reason or another. So this process that we are in is a very complicated one. It's a mythological journey in many, many, many ways. And it's because of those dimensions, because the animal should be held so sacred, because our intervention, while legitimate and natural and part of our biology, does not change the fact that we are consciously making the decision to do this, and we do kill these creatures. All of that complexity makes it very difficult to see evidence in the hunting world that animals are not really cared about, that they can be seen as just targets, that they can be seen as just, things that we don't have to be emotional about, and that, that we should be reluctant to talk about our emotional feelings, or that we should be reluctant to talk about any difficulty we feel in the process, and so on and so forth. And of course, it's those reactions, abnormal reactions, I call them, that lead us into such great difficulty with the broader public.
I was going to say that there are a lot of individuals that that I know personally that whether they, in the sense that they respect the animals as a whole, they're not likely to ever admit to having any kind of feelings for an animal that they've harvested specifically. And I guess one of my questions is, because I read a quote not too long ago in Backcountry Hunters and Anglers periodical that I get, and they mentioned a quote that it's been with me for a couple of years now, where it says that those who look at hunting from the outside, who are not hunters or non-hunters, that they're going to judge us based on our motives for why we kill animals. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that is an area in the hunting world that I'm a part of, that I hear a lot of different perspectives on, and get a lot of pushback on as well, in the sense that in Stephen Ranella wrote an article right after the Cecil the Lion event, and he discussed how hunters often say, we're all in this together and we need to stick together, that we need to defend one another. And so if I want to kill a pig, with a knife and a dog, that all the hunters should defend me for choosing to do it that way. And if I want to hunt, this way and kill an animal this way, then all the hunters should be on the same boat, and we should all work together. And it's almost us against them. And Ranella made this analogy that if we're all hunters and we're all in the same boat, and you have hunters shooting holes in the bottom of the boat, then maybe we got to kick a hunter off the boat. And that kind of, I guess for my part, I've always been one where I guess I'm not as aligned with a lot of what I see in the hunting world in terms of how they portray their motives for why they do what they do. And at the very least, as I discuss it, I remember hearing you on the Randy Newberg podcast, and Randy talking about killing an animal for the first time and seeing the life disappear from the eyes, and that was a very impactful experience for him. And I think many of us have been there. Where, for me, I can remember the first animal I ever killed, and what that experience was for me. I've had that conversation with other hunters who have said they don't remember, and they don't particularly feel a lot of emotion around that experience. For my part, regardless of how you feel, there's still a perception I feel like we as hunters have a responsibility to manage. I would rather someone actually feel something when that happens, when they kill an animal, that shows a compassion or a care for the species, for the animal, for life. But in the absence of that, if it's not there, one thing I think I heard you say it once, well, one should probably think about that and figure out why it's not there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, all human beings are different. We're an animal, and there's 7.5 billion of us on the planet, and as I've said many times, that means there's 7.5 human-animal engagements going on at any moment. I don't expect that all hunters will be on the same emotional wavelength in that experience any more than I expect all doctors to be on the same emotional experience when they deal with patients, or that I expect all police officers to be on the same emotional or empathetic, experience with respect to people they have to interact with. There's always going to be a bell curve, and people will be on one side, and some people will certainly be on the other. For me, animals have been the most important thing in my life. And so I don't see them as so different from us, to be quite honest with you. And the more I studied them, and the more I came to get close to them, to live with them, to walk with them, which I did for many years, much more so than most hunters ever have. I began to see things in them that made it ever more difficult to not care. When I was doing my caribou research for many years and working on black bears and moose at the same time, I would see circumstances where, a female caribou would lose its calf, for example. Maybe the calf was stillborn, or maybe the calf had been attacked by predators and died, or maybe the calf was just sickly and couldn't survive. And because I was in that country continuously, to be able to go back and find that female, staying by that calf for 7, 8, 9 days, going off to feed, coming back and still trying to raise it on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th day, and then still trying to raise it when the calf's body was just a teeming mound of maggots. Some people who could read about it might be very, René Descartes in their view, and say it's just instinct, it's just a kind of bunch of levers and pulleys, and it doesn't relate in any way to, human emotion. And I think that's total horseshit. In fact, our emotion is very similar to their emotion in that regard, but we are also different, of course, because we have this capacity, as far as we know, we're the only one who have this capacity for this conceptual kind of thinking. Mm-hmm. I doubt there are 2 caribou sitting down sharing a podcast today somewhere in Newfoundland, right? But nevertheless, my experience has been that they are very much like us, and as I have told a lot of young people, if you want to remember one thing, remember about hunting is remember they feel the bullet the same as you or I would. Start from there, and that is a reality. That is a truth. And if you cannot get over that realization, then perhaps hunting is not for you. Now, I don't believe that all hunters are going to feel that way, and I'm not on the pulpit here trying to get everybody to feel that way. Mm-hmm. But I can tell you that there are a lot of hunters who do have an emotional hill to climb at the moment of killing. You're there. You know that to have hunted, successfully, it ends with an animal's death. But that doesn't mean that, all hunters are either going to be quite emotional about that or that all hunters are going to be indifferent to that. You will find people on all scales of it. But to come to your point, the question is, what are we going to provide to the broad public? What is it that we are going to explain to the 96% now almost of the American public in one of the most intense hunting cultures in the world? Remember, in many parts of the world it's not even close to that, and in many states in this union there are less than 1.5% of the people who hunt. In some states in this union right now.
Right.
What are we going to offer to that broad public to say this activity remains relevant and remains acceptable in society? Now, if all of our friends are hunters and all of our business associates are hunters, then of course we're living in a cocoon. But the truth of the matter, the statistics don't lie. It's a tiny minority. So the question is, we know that the motivations for hunters matter very much to the broader public, not just to the anti-hunting public, of which there is a component, but also to the broad public. They want to know what we're doing it for. And regardless of our motivations, we may be able to explain benefits. So even if our motivations are not something the public wants, maybe our activities benefit human communities or lead to protection of habitat or lead to conservation. In other words, even without the best of motivations, we can make arguments that hunting can be a conservation mechanism. But the public, worldwide, is really saying what you've just raised. That's fine. First of all, we're only going to accept it if it has a conservation output. That trend is upon us now.
Right. Which
is something 20 years ago I argued if we didn't get there, the public would put us there, and the public is putting us there now. Mm-hmm. But even with that, the public wants to know why. And so we have surveys in the United States going back 40 years, which clearly indicates that if you tell a person in the public that you have hunted an animal to eat it, even if they don't really like hunting, or even if they would never do it themselves, they sit back and they say, well, I eat codfish, and I eat shrimp, and I eat pork, and I eat beef, and I eat chicken, so, yeah, that's okay. You tell them you do it for a variety of other purposes, and, it starts to decline. That hierarchy was not created by the anti-hunting community. That hierarchy of reaction was already in the American public. Now we have to ask ourselves as hunters, what does that portend? What does that mean in terms of what we should do in representing this? Because very often, as you know, the hunting community, or certain proponents of it, like to portray the whole debate over hunting as a black and white issue between us and them, so to speak,
right.
Between us who hunt and them that don't. Mm-hmm. And them that don't we give them names. We call them anties, we call them greenies, All these terms that you add the E's onto are generally derogatory terms. And so we create these derogatory terms for these people and say that, it's a battle between us and them. No, it's not a battle between us and them. It's a difference of opinion between us and them. The only battle is for the broad public mind. Because whether you live in a state that has a constitutional amendment that says you have the right to hunt, or whether you're in a state that doesn't, let me tell you something. If 95% of the American public in any state in this union come out and say, you know what, it's time for it to be over.
It's over.
Yeah. What do you think the legislators in that state are going to do?
Yeah, I've always said this. I've said this many times before, that just because it's legal doesn't make it okay. Just because it's legal doesn't mean that justifies an action. And if hunting, if you do something and you couch your activity or you hide behind the idea that it's legal to justify what you've done without another motive that's more sound or more viable to or more tolerable by those that have a compassion for animals, all it takes is for the law to change next month.
Yeah, totally.
And so
totally,
the motives still matter.
The motives will always matter. And, what I find hope in and strength in is that, I speak to and have spoken to an awful lot of hunters over a long career. And there are so many that are deeply and emotionally invested in wildlife and in the activity. I mean, yes, there are some who are not. I can't control that. Just like, some people don't care about their country, and some people don't care about their armed forces, and some people, don't care about their dogs. I can't control that.
Right.
But there are an awful lot of people who hunt and fish, who just can't imagine a world without those animals in it, and who work every day to safeguard them, and often for species and places that they'll never get to themselves to hunt, and so on and so forth. And so, while we can talk about the challenges, there's also this incredibly powerful, positive circulation of emotion, ideas, and commitment and passion within the hunting and angling communities in various parts of the world, but manifestly in Canada and the United States. That just has to give one hope that this kind of more complicated relationship exists.
You did a podcast recently, Secrets of Leadership. And in this podcast, I'll read a little bit of it here. Early conservation pioneers succeeded because they understood how to convey the importance of their ideals to the public. However, the conservation movement has, to a large extent, moved away from an agenda of trying to convince society of its social, cultural, and economic value. We no longer strive for the hearts of our nation's publics. The conservation community has replaced this with an emphasis on membership rosters and obtaining political influence. Both often emphasize specific issues that can hardly be viewed as being of the greatest public value or concern. The result has been an indifferent public, by and large, and one totally uninformed about conservation issues and the relevance of hunting in modern times.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have basically three problems facing the conservation of wildlife and of the world generally. We have too few people who care, number one, and those that do care are divided. And we're running out of money. And I can break down virtually any conservation problem as falling into one of those three categories. I believe that if we had more people who cared, and if they cared about the right things, we wouldn't have any problem with the money for conservation. So I also see the solution is tied up with those three things. When you have a country like the United States of America, where 99.99% of its citizenry, or 90% of its citizenry, 95% of its citizenry, whatever the figure is, has no idea about its conservation history, then I think we know that we have a long way to go to solving those three problems. And at the same time, when you have organizations that inevitably are born out of idealism. They start with 2 or 3 people, working in their basement, doing something, and eventually it emerges into a great organization. And over time, it becomes more bureaucratized, and the argument becomes, if we had more money, we could do more mission. If we had more membership, we could have more money. And eventually, it comes down to, all of which is true, but it comes down to that becomes the primary objective of the organization. Now, this is never true 100%. You know what I mean? It's not true that that's all they do.
Yeah,
but this
I get what you're saying.
But this is a trend that I've seen over and over and over again, even in the oldest conservation institutions we have in this country. So what I believe is necessary is for us to draw back to leap. A man comes to a stream when he's hiking through the country, and, it's as wide as this room, and as deep, and he doesn't want to get wet, and he's not prepared to wade through. He takes a dart back, and he runs, and he leaps, and he crosses that stream. And if he doesn't do that, if he doesn't draw back to leap, he gets halfway across in his leap, and he falls in that stream, right?
Right.
And so I think we have to look at where the idealism came from that launched the conservation ethos in America initially, and realize that what George Bird Grinnell and Ding Darling, and later and Alda Leopold in that same period with Darling, and George Bird Grinnell and John Muir did in the founding days of the conservation movement, what they did is they spoke to Americans' hearts. They didn't give them a great big pile of facts and figures. Oh, yes, they told them wildlife was disappearing and all of that, and they made that clear. But what they really said was, ultimately this: if you want to call yourself a citizen of the of the United States of America, you want to call yourself American, then here's one of the things you do. You look after the natural resources of this nation, and you do it in such a way that future generations are not impaired in their enjoyment of it. And if you do not do that, then do not call yourself an American patriot. Because without that, America will weaken and America will falter. And the lives of Americans will be diminished beyond repair. And it was because of those kinds of arguments, those kinds of emotional arguments, appealing to the best in the American people, that we ended up taking a nation that believed its resources were inexhaustible, that by religious faith and doctrine they should dominate the world, by economic theory of capitalism and individualism they should take as much as they possibly could, in the absence of game laws, in the absence of university programs, in the absence of wardens, in the absence of funding mechanisms, in the absence of state and federal agencies, at that time, in that circumstance, by speaking to the hearts of the people of this nation, they launched the conservation movement in this country, and they saved elk, and they saved pronghorn, and they saved grizzly bear, and they saved wood duck, and they saved Canada geese, and they saved wild turkey, and they saved mule deer, and they saved white-tailed deer, and on and on and on and on and on. We never had the facts at that time. We didn't have any facts to deliver. And so, this thing up here, as I've said many times, I see it as simply an elevator for the heart. You get at this, and you have a chance. And you don't get at this by showing 5 kill shots in a television program. You don't get at this by pretending that what's most important in the hunting experience is simply to, talk about the hunter as some kind of, as the great actor in this drama. You get at this by talking about, from the hunting perspective, the experience and about the animal. If you look, as I've said times before, at our historical writings in the area, in the genre of outdoor writing and in the genre of hunting and natural history and so on, it's very clear that up until the 1960s, the general theme of these articles and books and so on and so forth were about the experience that these people had. the early snows that came, the difficult climbs that they had, the mosquitoes and black flies that drove them nuts, the lameness of their horses, the accidents that took place. And the second major theme was the animals, how magnificent they were, how their talents enabled them to live in mountain areas or to cover distances in such rapid time, or to be aware that these people were in their midst long before those people were aware that they were there, these kinds of things. And so it was a glorification of the animal, and it was the glorification of the experience of being out there with them. And we took all that beauty, which enticed many people to become hunters and anglers, of course. We took all of that and we turned it into a commodified kind of activity where the death of the animal was glorified, and where it was all about the hunter. I've done this, I've done that, I've done the other thing. Now, these are broad patterns I'm talking about. There are exceptions, of course. But we all know that this broad pattern existed. We all know that there's a tremendous percentage of people in the hunting world who do not like many of the publications and television shows and so on and so forth that portray hunting. We know this is true. This is not a fiction that Shane Mahoney is making up. We know it's true.
Right.
So if that's true of the hunting public, my goodness, what do we think the non-hunting public is thinking about these things? So we definitely, and I think we are, by the way, starting to make a turn in this. I think from a purely economic point of view, many television shows and channels and so on are beginning to realize that if they don't make a shift in this, there won't be enough money to run these things, because it's becoming socially less and less acceptable. Now, overall, I think this is a good thing. I wish we hadn't gone through this phase, but I think it's a good thing, and I think the future will be publications and shows and communications on this interaction with nature that leads to a lethal conclusion, that we will present this as part of a broader palette of engagements in nature that involve the harvest of wild fungi and mushrooms, the harvest of berries, the harvest of wood, the experience in nature. And part of that experience in nature, for some people, is also the harvest of wild creatures, done legally, done as humanely as is possible, and where the animal is fully utilized. And I think, frankly, it's going to be the only future.
To hear you talk, I think about what it would be like had we just done what other countries had done over, thousands of years. And when we came here, had we wiped out all those species you mentioned? Because we were so close. To have elk be gone, to have buffalo
hard to believe
be gone. I go out and I elk hunt every year. I fill my freezer with elk, and to hear them screaming in the wilderness and to see them, it's just a magnificent sight. The idea that there would be no mule deer and no elk and so on is kind of a very it's hard to imagine that, but then you can look at many European countries and see that many of the species they started with are gone. It's interesting when you sit there and you tell me that, the broader community, of course they expect you to hunt for food. That's sort of an intellectual exercise that makes sense. They'd be a hypocrite if they eat burgers and yet they chastise you for killing an animal and eating it yourself. But they still want that motive to be one that they see as pure. And I think that is something for all hunters to think about. And as they produce content like I do, I go out and film my hunts, and I record shows and try to show the adventure that I'm having, and not just that, but the beauty that I'm surrounded by. I ask myself, do I produce content that fails the public or my overall goal, or does it help with it? And I think I've done some of both. over the years. But I can see that I feel like a lot of that tide is shifted, especially in the last few years, where I see a lot more productions around hunting that resonate with me, that have more depth and more meaning to me than what I saw in the past. And the messages that I want to share and that I want other hunters to share are messages that are above reproach from those that are on the outside looking in. But mostly I want them to feel inspired to want to go outside and have their own experience in the outdoors. If at the end of the day they watch something and they go, now I want to go out and do this or just see it, then I feel like you're winning. You're moving the world in a better direction than if you're going the other way. I enjoyed the talk where you spoke to the outdoor writers and you explained, and it got me thinking when you said, now it seems that people write about them, it's all about the hunter. And in the past, it was all about the animal, that species and that experience, and how changing that story, I think, will be a very impactful by an army of hunters. Because with social media today, we can all tell our own story. We can all put it out there. And I think with that comes a tremendous responsibility to do it the right way.
Well, yes, there is a tremendous responsibility. And what we should also realize is that to some extent it won't be controversy that we'll need to worry most about for hunting. And I've said this for many years. It will be about relevance. Whether hunting remains relevant in modern society, and what does relevance imply, or what does relevance include? There has to be a purpose to it that people understand at a human level. When we get into the issue of food, people relate to that. We have a growing sense of concern about the quality of the food that we eat, and with evidence to indicate that we should have concerns. We know that this wild food is the most healthy kind of food that you can possibly consume. And we also know that if we are able to harvest this wild food and consume it, that the natural systems are working well, which is also something that the modern public is obviously concerned about and should be more concerned about. So, I think we have an incredible story to tell. And I wish that more of the hunters who come up to me after an address and say how much they agree and, how much they feel that this is what hunting is about, and that they can't relate to, these other characterizations of hunting. I wish that more of them would actually write their own stories and explain this, and not be afraid either of the emotionality of it. When I tell people I'm in love with animals, there's a certain segment of the hunting public that gets uneasy because they say, if we say something like that, then how can we say we also kill them? But I say, is not the rancher fairly well respected? Is not the shepherd fairly well respected in historical memory? Is not the farmer? I mean, aren't there all kinds of examples where people have been successful in explaining that they care for animals, and yet who know at the end of the day that the animals they care for are actually going to be killed and eaten? So if that's the case, why is it so impossible for the hunting community to make this statement? But furthermore, I personally believe that if we're not able to convince the broad public that we really do care, then our utilitarian arguments are going to eventually just wither and fray like a rope that's exposed to salt water and eventually just narrows and snaps and narrows and snaps and narrows and snaps until there's nothing left to it. And I have hunters come up to me all the time who say things like, Shane, you know what? I don't hunt nearly as much anymore. And I'll say, oh yeah, well, that happened for a lot of reasons. And they say, well, I just don't want to anymore. I love to be out there with them. I love to see them. Certainly still support hunting. I go hunting with maybe my son or some friends or whatever, but you know what? I just don't want to kill them anymore. I just don't want to do that part of it anymore. Now, you see, those people say it to me almost like, we got to go into a phone booth or something and talk about it.
Right.
But I just wish they would say that openly, because I guarantee you that a non-hunting member of the public listening to their totally sincere, honest stories, which include the fact I have hunted a lot, I may still hunt somewhat, but I also just simply love to be out there with them, and if push comes to shove, I'll take that over actually hunting them. That is the kind of narrative that the modern public is going to find acceptable. So I think that there are a lot of individual hunters who are more than capable of being spokespersons for hunting, but they think it should be left to people like Shane Mahoney, who gets up in front of an audience of 3,000 or 4,000 people and talks about this. But I think there are tons and hundreds, thousands and thousands and thousands of hunters who could give just really meaningful testimony to why this activity remains relevant in their lives, how it has motivated them to volunteer, to conserve, to donate to conservation organizations, to do all the things that are necessary. I think there's look, we have a reservoir of talent and experience and historical evidence that if any other group in society had it, would have mobilized it so much more effectively, so long ago, that it's just incredible to me to think that in some cases we're still talking about this problem.
Yeah.
Teddy Roosevelt was talking about it appropriately, 120 years ago. 1887, he brought together 100 American citizens and said, there's going to be a club of 100 wealthy Americans. You've done well by this country, and now I expect you to give back. And I'm not asking you to give back on health care or transportation corridors, or they're all important things. I'm asking you to put your money and your expertise and your connections, your political capital, your publishing empires, your this, your that, into the conservation of America's wildlife. 1887. This is, 2017. So it's taken us a while.
Well, and to be honest, until I heard you speak, some time ago and a few others, till I had seen some Meat Eater episodes and followed some of what Stephen Ranella had written and read some of his books, I hunted my whole life and didn't know about a lot of this.
Well, the good news there is that can certainly be true. My life has been given to wildlife conservation. I'm a professional in this business. I ran research programs and institutions and, graduate students. This is what I've done all of my life. All of it motivated totally by a love for animals. Absolutely nothing else can explain the proportion of my living moments that I have given to conservation. And I could say it's, some sort of idealism. I could say it's some sort of pure intellectualism. I could say any of those things, but it would all be a lie. It's because from an earliest age, they enthralled me, and I got to see so much and experience so much with them that I just can't imagine a world without them. We can have mountains, and we can have streams, and we can have forests, but I guarantee you, if those living creatures aren't in there, they're just postcards. That's all they are. You know, they still might have green trees, there still might be water flowing in brooks, and there still might be mountains that run to the sky. But if there's nothing living in them, they're meaningless. And so, you know, I don't expect every person who hunts and fishes to have had that life trajectory. People become doctors and lawyers and teachers and do all kinds of important, interesting things in life. And they hunt and they fish. Well, they can't possibly have given the years to it that I've given to it, or others like me have given to it. That's just not a reasonable expectation. I'm very interested in medical science, but I'm certainly can't be a doctor.
Yeah.
You know, so the good news is, however, that we now have the opportunity and the communication mechanisms for more voices to be heard. And frankly, we are seeing a turning of the tide. We are finally, this is the first time ever since I began to speak about these issues 25 years ago and more. This is the very first time that I have begun to see a shift in the quality of the television shows and in the writing back to where it should have always been. Now, we need to go much further. We need to do it much faster. And we need to take it out of the hands of elites. We need to just have the individual hunter and angler, you know, talking more as they can now through social media about why they do it and the benefits it brings to them and the experiences that they have. And you're right. You know, when you say, you know, it was after hearing some of these things and reading different things that you became more cautious about how you represent, or more careful in how you represented it. That's necessary, because we can sometimes, as hunters and anglers, say and do things that we're used to. You know, it's been part of our experience. We're not aware of all that's going on because we've been through it so many times. But for the person in the general public, or for people in our own families, you know, I mean, I don't think very many people are going to take a really young boy or girl on an experience where they might be overwhelmed. Often you try to introduce them a little gradually to this activity, right?
Right.
Well, just imagine the 35, 45, 55-year-old non-hunting member of the public. They're like that little child. They've never been a part of this. They've never seen any of this. They love their dogs. They love their cats. They love their budgie birds, which I do. They love all those things, and therefore they translate that, and they can't understand that world. Mm-hmm. And who's going to tell it to them? We have to tell it to them. And we better tell it to them in the right way, or they get the impression that we are Rooseveltian and Leopoldian, or they get the impression that we're just a bunch of barbarians.
Which is which I agree is changing. There is a swelling tide of, I guess, there's so much beauty in being in the outdoors. And to see that kind of footage really does, and the films around that. I've seen more films where an animal isn't killed than ever before.
Yeah. And
how ironic, because in the past, if there wasn't an animal killed, then the footage is no good.
Exactly. It was a total failure, which is so ridiculous. I mean, the number of articles written about failed hunts is far more than the articles written about successful ones.
Right.
And
especially, I think, when you read the old-timey stuff.
Exactly. I mean, after all, it just, there were many things not available to them that are available to us today. Even the gear we have and the exposure to the elements we can endure because of, the kinds of products that are out there and so on and so forth, the optics that we have. I mean, there's a lot of things, obviously, even the rifles and shotguns and bows. And I mean, there's been a lot of technological advance too, right?
Yeah.
And so, but ultimately, I mean, there are so many empirical things we should do. It is great for hunters, for example, to support hunting-based organizations. But I'd like to appeal to hunters out there to support non-hunting organizations that are involved in conservation. support groups that are in the middle, support Audubon societies, and support Sierra clubs. This is an interesting thing. Quite a number of years ago, I did a fair amount of work with the Sierra Club, and knew people there, and spoke before their board, and spoke at some of their events, and so on and so forth. And it was amazing. I heard a lot of hunters say, "Well, Sierra Club, that's an anti-hunting organization, Sierra Club," and I'm thinking in my mind, here's the great Sierra Club founded by the amazing wilderness prophet John Muir, and then I mentioned to them that at the time, Sierra Club had, 700,000 members or something, and about 125,000 of them had held hunting or fishing licenses, or maybe more. And so I said, well, actually, it makes them one of the largest hunting and fishing organizations in the United States of America based on that membership. And so, we developed this idea that, again, it's us and them. Well, the Sierra Club, for example, stands for wilderness. Don't we stand for wilderness? Don't we like wilderness? What, are we against that? Is that a bad word in the lexicon of hunters? This is another thing that the hunting community really needs to understand. We are less than 4.5% in this nation, and we need allies, and we need friends, and we need to find common ground. And at the same time, the conservation of wildlife is faced with ever-increasing problems. So if we care about conservation of wildlife, and if we care about our own tradition and our own activity, we had better get a lot better at building coalitions and a lot worse at building fences.
I agree. I really like you talk about the snake and the bulge in the snake.
Yeah.
We have a lot of hunting community that's aged.
Yep.
And we had, for a long period of time, a lack of hunter recruitment.
Yep.
And we used a lot of old school ways to try to recruit hunters, just like the way we grew up hunting.
Yep.
And yet didn't really move the needle. And we still have this big gap. But in recent years, you've described how you've got some hope, and because things are changing. Can you share a little bit of that?
Yeah, we know that it's inevitable that the numbers of hunters and the percentage of hunters in this country and in Canada is going to decline. No matter what we do, it is going to decline because we simply will never be able to recruit enough to offset the massive die-off of people between the age of 55 and 75 that's going to take place in the next 20 years.
Right.
And so that's the bulge in the snake I talk about. You can actually watch it moving through the snake, and there's no going back, It's going to keep moving through the snake.
Right.
We developed a lot of hunter retention, recruitment, reactivation approaches, and by and large, they've not been very successful. And I believe they've not been very successful primarily because we tried to create for a modern society the world that we grew up in. So people said, I grew up on the farm and my dad taught me to hunt, or my Uncle Jack taught me to hunt, or I could go across the road and I could hunt there, and I could bring my shotgun to school on my bike, and I could do blah, blah, blah. And so people said, okay, well, let's recreate that. Then let's develop programs, youth hunts, special hunts, early hunts, later hunts. Take one with you when you go hunting, do all that kind of stuff. Many of those things were completely unrealistic because modern society is not that way. It's not built that way. And yes, I may take a neighbor's friend or a friend's son or daughter out hunting for one time. And just think of the investments that's going to be necessary to make that young person a hunter.
Yeah.
So we made the mistake of trying to create a present in the image of our past. It's impossible. And
there's a lot of hunters who don't want to hear that.
No, of course not. A lot of hunters who don't want to hear it. But the reality and the good news on the flip side is that while it's still obviously desirable and possible for hunters to, teach their children about this activity and see if they want to be a part of it, at the same time, we are seeing people joining hunting who did not come from hunting families. women between the ages of 25 and 40, and young men who are coming from urban centers who are coming to hunting for completely different reasons. They're modern people in modern society coming to hunting for modern reasons. Now, we can try to get the modern people to come into hunting for reasons that don't relate to them and experiences they can't understand.
Yeah.
Or we can try and encourage people to come into hunting from the context of where their own lives really are. Now, I think that's a pretty simple decision to make.
And exciting.
And incredibly exciting because they will bring a different energy and viewpoint to all of this. I think they will be much more ecologically oriented. They will be much more aware, I think, of the challenges facing the world in terms of loss of nature, loss of diversity. I think they will be very fluid in modern society. They're fluid with the technologies. They're fluid with the communication devices. They're much more fluid in this regard. And I think some of them are surprising modern society in a way that we and our children wouldn't.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, that makes sense. That man has been a hunter, so therefore, yeah, his son's a hunter, his daughter's a hunter. Well,
right.
Yeah, but all of a sudden over here is, the young girl with, 8 earrings and like different color hair and wearing different sneakers. And, she works with a software company in the middle of a great big city, has taken up hunting. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that has a certain amount of relevance value. That's relevance there. Because she is, or he, in the case may be, is part of a truly modern society, and yet they have reached a decision that they will hunt, in most cases, of course, to procure the best meat that they can possibly have, and a source of meat that they feel totally confident is healthy for them. So this is why I've started this Wild Harvest initiative, because we need to take advantage, if you will, of that sentiment to turn those modern hunters into modern conservationists and take advantage of the opportunity that from cities we can recruit people who care about conservation and who also will care about hunting and angling, which for ages we've said is our nemesis, right?
Right.
It's because we no longer live in rural communities and we don't, grow up on the family farm and, cities are bad places and all this kind of thing, that we felt the situation was almost impossible. Well, this new generation of hunters and anglers that's arising is proving that that's not the case at all. But they're coming to it from a different life trajectory than others of us came to it. I think this is an incredibly hopeful sign, along with this turning of the tide in how we represent hunting in our communication work. I think this rise of hunters from these unexpected reservoirs of humanity is another of the most significant and hopeful signs that I have seen. Now, if we can take all of that and turn it into a greater movement for the conservation of wildlife, I do not care one whit about whether someone hunts or fishes.
Yep, you told me.
But I care desperately about whether they care about wildlife.
Right.
But if they want to come to it in a white robe and sandals, or they want to come to it, fitted out with the latest technology that allows them to hunt wildlife or fish, I welcome them all. Because the ultimate objective is to make sure that mountains and streams and alpine meadows and forests and prairies are not devoid of life.
I have been doing CrossFit for years, maybe 6 years or so. I read the book, The Paleo Solution, and then that led to The Primal Blueprint and a number of other books about eating healthy and more of a natural hunter-gatherer type lifestyle. And as I've been part of that fitness community and in that group, I have witnessed literally hundreds of people who have never hunted in their life, never grew up around it, were in big cities, that are now picking up a bow and arrow, picking up a gun, learning how to shoot, and going hunting, learning how to apply for a tag, the whole deal.
Oh.
And
it's pretty complicated in some cases.
it is, but it's to me I'll go to the gym, and there'll be a lot of people that come up to me that I've already coached along the way. This is how you hunt. This is how you do it. This will get you started. And I think for me to as a hunter to not embrace that would be the greatest mistake I could make in terms of the future of hunting. And I really appreciate what Randy Newberg has said. I've heard him say this a number of times, that for him, he really does believe that there's something about the taking of an animal and the hunting experience that causes you to care about wildlife. And for that reason, he wants more hunters hunting.
Sure.
It's almost counterintuitive, because a lot of hunters are like, I don't want more people hunting. They interfere with my hunting. But at the end of the day, more hunters out there hunting, the more we have a body of people who are passionate about the outdoors. But as you said, not everyone it's not that hunting is a prerequisite in order for you to care about wildlife. It's not.
No. But
there is a correlation.
Yeah, I mean, we have enough evidence to prove that a percentage of the people who hunt will become people who will become advocates for wildlife. We also have evidence that there are people who don't hunt who can become advocates for wildlife, and we shouldn't forget that. But I think the conservation of wildlife is far more important than the continuance of hunting. An interesting question for hunters to pose to themselves is this: if they felt that their hunting was not contributing to the conservation of wildlife, would they continue to do it? And I'm not going to advise people that one answer is better than another, but I think it's an important question for hunters to ask themselves. We have seen in the last half century, almost a 40 to 50% loss in the abundance of wildlife on this planet. And there's every indication that we're going to continue to see a continued decline in this. Now, for those of us who live in Canada and the United States, where by virtue of geography, by virtue of relatively small population numbers, by virtue of good institutions, we still have, turkeys in our driveways and, elk bugling and, white-tailed deer bounding across our roads and in our fields and all of, swarms of waterfowl coming in. It's kind of hard for us to think about that, but that's the truth of the matter. And I also believe that these ideas about conservation and these ideas about the sustainable use of wildlife and hunting of wildlife, how that can contribute to the conservation of wildlife, which is so well exemplified in Canada and the United States. I think this is a story that I believe really needs to be told, and I have that as somewhat of a personal mission, and I'm much involved now in international circuits where I'm constantly talking about this as one example of where this has truly made a difference. And as a result of that, finally I'm beginning to see, which is another change, a more and more reference to the North American system of conservation as an example of a successful conservation system. It was amazing to me when I started this work about 10 years ago to realize that even the most informed individuals in the most informed institutions in the world had absolutely no idea of what we had accomplished here in North America.
It wasn't covered in my school.
No.
It wasn't in college. It wasn't anywhere.
No, so if it wasn't here, you can imagine
my dad didn't
how
tell
far.
me. What I mean?
Well, no, because, of course,
his dad didn't tell him.
His dad didn't tell him. But we have the capacity now to tell everyone, right? And this, of course, is partly what this podcast is about, is to try to reach everybody. But what we need to do as well, of course, is to diversify our messages and our platforms sufficiently that, we are attracting to these discussions people who are genuinely interested in knowing about this, but to whom that world is foreign.
Right.
And, you know, one of the things I said many times to hunting organizations is that if you really want to portray hunting as something that you think others should accept and perhaps even participate in, then you should think about focusing on what it would take to get them to come with you, not so much on what do you think it would take them to be you. So if you could show them an experience that they say, I never can hunt the animal in the sense of shooting it or drawing the bow on it. I can't kill the animal. I just can't do that, which is a totally understandable thing to me. I mean, that's just simple. You know, to spend 5 seconds thinking about that, it's totally understandable. But if we present hunting properly, I think there should be a lot more people who would like to come with us. Right?
Yeah.
If I say to somebody, for example, come with me and simply walk with caribou on the island of Newfoundland, which you can easily do. You know, you just get out with them in the rutting season, you just walk with them. They just, you know, so trusting caribou are, you can really be just with them. You know, there's hardly a human being I know who wouldn't do that in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
But, you know, if I was to say to that same broad group of people in the public, let's go out and hunt those animals, they're immediately thinking about the killing, right? That's you know.
It's interesting.
You know?
Yeah, yeah.
But, in fact, that moment is the length of time it takes you to breathe in and out 3 or 4 times, and to squeeze a piece of metal looking through an optic, or to draw back and then finally release. It's seconds or maybe half a minute or something out of what might be a day, a week, or longer.
Yeah.
And if it happens well, as you always hope, the animal dies very quickly. Some cases, instantly. Mm-hmm. In other cases, so quickly that they hardly know what has happened. And it should be possible for people to want to have that experience, and even up until the point where they say, yeah, but I don't want to be there when the animal's shot. And in fact, we are seeing evidence for this in that, you know, people who run big conservancies in places like Africa are seeing groups of people who come now who are not just want to photograph the animals, or who don't just want to hunt the animals. They're actually finding people now who want to come and tag the animals. So they shoot them with a dart because there's scientific research going on, but they have the opportunity to sort of do both, right? So you ask yourself, what motivates the individual who hunts, we understand, who photographs, we understand. But to me, it's fascinating. Why would a person want to go to that step of darting the animal? And I think, in part, it's because it's a very similar motivation for hunting. Because one of the motivations for hunting is to possess. Right?
Yes.
It is. It's to possess. And part of that process of possession is finally being able to get up to that animal, and it doesn't leave. It doesn't escape. It doesn't run away. You can look at it. You can feel it. You can touch it. You can smooth it. You can touch the fur. You can touch the antler. You can do these kinds of things. And it's a really fascinating exploration of people's behavior, that and they'll say, oh, I didn't want to shoot it, but to be up close to it like that, and all of this kind of thing. And, you know, then you talk to hunters who will say, you know, and you see this written in many times, for some reason, if I could have given that animal back its life, I would have. Lots of hunters have said that. Yeah. Tons of hunters have said that over their hunting careers.
Yeah.
You know?
I've noticed, like, when I hunted blacktails in the Northwest, that there was a particular deer or two that I would identify and follow for years.
Yeah.
And I found myself not wanting to shoot deer that I had watched for 3 or 4 years in a row and letting them walk, because I would rather know that they're there than to take it.
Yep.
And that was a new experience for me, because I didn't expect to feel that way. So I let deer leave. I was, oh, he's not big enough, and maybe he'll be bigger and older next year.
But that was just an excuse.
It really was.
Yeah.
And I, being honest with myself over the years, and then there was one buck that I remember harvesting that I had followed for years. And there was a profound sense of loss when the animal was gone.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe he had another year or two on his own anyway. He was getting old. But still, to know he wasn't there anymore, there was a feeling of loss there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the thing about becoming intimate, essentially, with individual animals. It happens a lot in science, too. You capture animals, and so you have them collared for long periods of time. I had a black bear. I collared a lot of bears in my career. I worked closely with black bears for 20-odd years. And so hundreds of bears were collared. And, some of them would shed their collars, some would tear them off, the collars would be turned in, hunters had taken the animal. But I still remember one in particular, he was a big, big male, probably 620, 650, big black bear. And we knew that and actually caught him near, he was killing a lot of moose calves. We had a lot of moose calves collared in a particular area, and they were just being knocked off one after the other. And finally we found him on one. And we collared this bear. And, we watched him den, and then the next spring, the first time I found him, he looked really bad, and he was limping. And I suspected a cow moose, broke his forearm. Anyway, I had that, bear named, as I often name the animals. And of course, some people say it's terrible naming animals, and they blame Walt Disney for naming animals, and that's another urban myth. Native Americans and all indigenous people named animals all the time. We've been naming our pets from time immemorial. And to give that credit to Walt Disney seems a pretty absurd distortion of history to me. But anyway, Cornelius was this guy's name. He was named after a colleague of mine, who was also a big, robust man. And so he eventually deteriorated, and he just couldn't fend for himself in this way. And he eventually, retreated into his own body. He lost all his muscle and lost his mass, and then he had this huge pelt that was, just hanging off him, really, because he was such a big animal. And I did a lot of following of those animals on foot. I spent almost all my time on foot, even though I had access to helicopters all the time. And he ended up inadvertently in a fight with another bear during the breeding season of the next year. Made it through his first fall and winter in that condition, and then came out the next year even worse, and just got beaten up by this other bear who just kind of took advantage of him. There's really nothing he could have done. But that was in June, late June, and then I would periodically relocate him totally out of personal interest, and concern for this animal, really. I thought about shooting him, but in the end I said no. And eventually that animal died. Cornelius died in the autumn, a beautiful time in Newfoundland. And he died in the middle of a berry field, a barren field full of blueberries. And he literally was draped over sort of a hummock, like you might see your dog or cat, just resting in the sun, like kind of just totally at ease. And, you know, of all the bears I've known, and the ones that have given me concern, and the ones that were just jokers, and the ones that were just indifferent, you know, there's an animal there whose loss seemed to diminish that entire country. So I know exactly what you feel about this. And this is partly why the friends of mine who raised animals for food and got to know them as individuals would prefer that when I came, that the animals would be killed. Yet they could go and they could hunt a strange deer or a strange goose or a strange whatever.
I would take my tag and go to the east side of Oregon and hunt. So I would shoot a deer that wasn't one on
totally. That's
my
totally
place.
But you see, that's totally. But see, these are the narratives that will resonate with people who are trying to make up their minds about whether people really care or not. Now, if we don't tell those narratives to this broader public who we need on our side, you know, I'm telling you, I was born and raised on the island of Newfoundland. And we had a thing called the seal hunt, the harp seal hunt, which was one of the most famous animal hunting controversies the world has ever seen. This was a 400-year-old unbroken tradition. Incredibly important, at one point, essential for the very survival of the communities on the northeast coast of the island of Newfoundland, where, believe me, you didn't run out to Burger King to get something to eat, which poured small amounts of money, but relatively huge amounts of money based on family income into those communities, provides a source of fresh meat, skins, and now we know tremendous medicinal products in terms of its oils, which obviously were very healthy for the people living there. We had our heroes associated with that hunt. We had our stories. We had our songs. We had our art. This was an iconic part of Newfoundland culture. The politicians loved it. Businesses loved it. The people loved it. So we thought, for all of those reasons, there's absolutely no way we can ever lose this. And then people came who saw the world differently. Some of them were legitimate and genuine. Some of them were just money makers, vaudeville people who wanted to raise money. But through it all, they essentially managed to tear down that edifice to the point now where it is, you know, just a tiny remnant of what it used to be. And I use that story to remind people who live in rural America, who live in the state of Montana, who live in British Columbia, who live anywhere in this continent, that just because you've got something that you've had for a long time, and just because your politicians of today tell you they stand with you, and just because it's economically important to Bozeman, Montana, or any other community that we might talk about where hunting is big and fishing tackle is sold and, you know, people move here for the lifestyle and all that kind of stuff, don't you think for a moment that it can't be changed. It won't happen in a day, and it didn't happen that way in Newfoundland. But after 30 years of continuous protest and hundreds of millions probably spent on the effort, the Newfoundland seal hunt, while it still continues, is just a wraith, a shadow of what it formerly was. And we now have 7.2 million harp seals, and they're doing well, and they're fabulous animals. But this whole cultural identity and this legitimate and undoubtedly sustainable harvest of wildlife, which is all done and has been for years done with rifles now. The clubbing was long been banned. Mm-hmm. The baby white seals haven't been killed for 30 years. So despite the fact that it's essentially no different than hunting an elk, that has literally been taken away.
I say that all the time. I say it all the time because it and that's where, circling back, the perception of hunting, our motives for why we do it, matters greatly. And I would like to see I say this all the time as well. I'd like to see the hunting community at large, the regular Joe Blow who has a great influence in his local circle and the people around him, to be sharing his experience with the outdoors and the beauty there. I should let you go. We've been talking for quite a while, but before we do, I have one more kind of selfish question. When people look back on their lives and they kind of, see the road that they've traveled, there's usually some pivotal moment that they, one or two, that completely maybe changed the direction of their life or changed how they saw the world. And I'm curious if you have a pivotal moment like that you can share.
I don't think so, not with regard to nature. My first memories, I lived in a place called St. Anthony on the northern peninsula of Newfoundland at a time. I was born in 1956, so this was in the late 1950s. There were no highways at all, and people were still traveling there at that time by dog sled. And it was a very cold place and a very wild and rugged place. And my first memories, I have four of them actually from that time period. One was of my catching bees in a jar on thistles. I would have been just under 3 and into 3.5 at that time. And remembering being stung, I must have been wearing short pants. The second is being under the wharf in the wintertime with 2 children. I don't know who they were or are. They were older than me, which meant they were probably 6 or 7. And there was a board out on the ice, total dead of winter, freezing cold. And the board was tilted, and there was a string on the board, and there was crumbs underneath in the hope of catching snow buntings. They used to come in large numbers. And the hope was we could pin them under the board, and then we could keep them. And the third memory I have is of a kitchen where we used to have bullbirds that are called dovekies. They're an alcid that come down from the Arctic, and they're a little small bird. But fresh meat was hard to get in Newfoundland at that time. And so hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these birds would be shot, and then they'd be brought into the kitchens, which was the only room that was heated in our houses. And in the kitchen, or the wood stoves, the women would be there with hundreds, maybe 1,000, 500, whatever, these small black and white birds on the table, and they would be plucking all of these birds. The point is that from the very earliest memories of my life, animals were what mattered. I don't remember those women around that table except they were there, and I don't really remember who those children were, but I can remember those snow buntings, and I can remember those bees, and I can remember those bullbirds on that table. And it just went from there to a continuous engagement with crabs and sticklebacks and fish off the wharf and trouting by myself at a young age and being searched for. And so there really wasn't a moment, and there never has been a moment in my life that I have not been fascinated by animals.
Yeah.
And then I went into this field and then had a job as chief of research where I was still a boy essentially, walking the beaches and turning over stones and catching crabs and catching eels and all this kind of thing. And so for me, it's just kind of been seamless.
Yeah,
it's just the way it was and remains.
Well, I definitely had a pivotal moment when I heard you first talk to Randy Newberg on that podcast with him, and definitely changed my way of thinking about conservation in the world around me. And there's been other moments similar in the last few years, especially as I've done Gritty Bowmen and gone down this road. And since then, I've listened to your podcast and other things that you've come out with. And I want to encourage everyone that's listened to the podcast to go out and subscribe to your podcast, Conservation Matters, and also get engaged and really take to heart the things that we discussed today and put them to proactive use in their lives for the benefit of all.
Yeah.
I just want to say thanks.
You're welcome.
I really I'm glad to have met you in person, and I truly appreciate what you're doing. The Wild Game Initiative is something that we didn't discuss, but I think is going to be a hugely impactful and life-changing, world-changing endeavor. And so for those that are listening that don't know about that, you'll learn about it when you go and listen to Shane's podcast, and when you follow what he's doing, and
go on my website. You'll see it.
And still one of my all-time favorite podcasts is the one that you did with Randy, the first one. I really did enjoy it when you talked about the cave paintings and how sports and lighted candles inside of a dim rock wall restaurant, how those things are, there's so much truth and knowledge and wisdom in what you said in that podcast that really brought a lot home for me. So I encourage people to go listen to that episode. And that story you told, I've listened to it 3 or 4 times, of your caribou experience on that Rookie Hunter podcast. I believe that was it, and you shared it on the end of that show. And I really, you can tell a story, that's for sure. And you did a fabulous job on that, and it really, it made me feel like I was the guy there watching it. So anyway, I just want to say thank you. And
you're very welcome. It's a real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Take care. Stay gritty.
Thank you.
In 1907, only 41,000 elk remained in North America, and in 1950, only 12,000 pronghorn remained. Today, there are more than 1 million elk and 1.1 million pronghorn. Why? Because hunting is conservation. In 1937, hunters actually requested an 11% tax on guns, ammo, bows, and arrows to help fund conservation. That tax so far raised more than $8 billion for wildlife conservation. Altogether, hunters pay more than $1.6 billion a year for conservation programs. No one gives more. It's obvious that hunters care about animals, and yet we actively hunt and kill them. Many people cannot understand this dichotomy. How can we both care about animals and also kill them? It's a question that I challenge all of you to consider. Here is an excerpt from the Gritty Bowmen film, Alberta, with a quote from Fred Bear that describes my feelings on this subject. The first shot on this buck was fatal, and it cleanly pierced his vitals, but he didn't go down. I hate to see animals suffer, and when possible, I will always shoot them again if I have the opportunity. I have tremendous respect for this buck and his will to survive. He didn't go down easy, and I have mixed emotions about that. At times like this, I am reminded of a quote by Fred Bear, which somewhat describes my thoughts on this matter. Quote, I have always tempered my killing with respect for the game pursued. I see the animal not only as a target, but as a living creature with more freedom than I will ever have. I take that life if I can, with regret as well as joy, and with the sure knowledge that nature's way of fang and claw and starvation are a far crueler fate than I bestow. I do not hunt for the joy of killing, but for the joy of living. and the inexpressible pleasure of mingling my life, however briefly, with that of a wild creature that I respect, admire, and value. We can argue as much as we like, but the fact is, hunting is man's oldest and most successful try at life. Every human being is alive today because our ancestors hunted. So it's a relatively new phenomenon for people to regard hunting as a cruel and frivolous activity that has no worth outside of personal gratification for the hunter. The funny thing is, hunting has increased my appreciation for wild animals and wild places, not decreased it. And as I watch society lose its ties to wildlife and conservation, I feel my bond with nature grow ever stronger in direct correlation to my time spent hunting. I understand now more than ever that hunting is the greatest hope for creating the next generation of true conservationists. Never stop sharing your passion for hunting in the outdoors. Our wild animals and wild places depend on it. As always, good luck on your hunts and stay gritty.
This is Ty Stubblefield, and you're listening to the Gritty Bowmen.
Gritty Bowmen.